Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ostrom Research Series. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Abdul Aijaz, who is the visiting research fellow with the Ostrom workshop here at Indiana University. Aijaz holds a dual PhD in geography and English literature, and his research explores water scarcity and environmental politics at the intersection of resource geography, environmental humanities, and development studies in South Asia, particularly in the Indus Basin of Pakistan. His work has been supported by organizations such as Social Science Research Council, the Fulbright Foundation, and the American Institute of the Pakistan Studies, and has appeared in several journals, including Antipod, Environment and Planning, Nature and Space, Literary Geographics, and the Journal of Political Science, among others. His current book project examines the politics and poetics of water and hydrosocial crisis in the canal colonies of Punjab. Today, Aijaz will be presenting a talk titled Factional Ecologies, Politics of Nature in Uncertain Times. Please join me in welcoming Aijaz.
Thank you so much, Mahdi, for that generous introduction. I just want to take a moment to express my gratitude and that it's a privilege to be here at the workshop. The workshop helped me, in a way, think with certain ideas that I'm going to talk about. And it's such an amazing laboratory for thinking with others. So my ideas might be sort of on the margins of what we talk about here in general, but I'm thinking, and I think I actually believe that these ideas are in spirit of Ostrom's thought, and it's really a privilege to be sharing this new thing that I've been toying with for a minute, but have not really kind of thought through it until now. And even now, I don't think I've completely thought through it. So it's an exercise in thinking together with you all. So it's thinking with this concept of factional ecology. So I want to sort of situate this talk within my larger work on water and politics and environmental transformation in the Indus Basin in Punjab. If you look at this map, these 5 rivers were engineered a great deal during the colonial period, and that this engineering project, this hydraulic engineering project, resulted in the construction of one of the world's largest irrigation system in the world. But this hydraulic infrastructure was also sort of connected with a parallel social infrastructure where local people were brought together, brought from other parts of India and settled here. This was an extremely pastoral landscape that was within a period of a few decades, totally transformed from a pastoral landscape to settler agrarian landscape. And it was not an easy transformation. It was a difficult transformation. So I'm going to, and at this point right now, all that hydraulic infrastructure is one of, firstly, it is very old. So, and Pakistan is not a very rich state, so it does not have all the finances to keep investing in this infrastructure. And the second thing that it faces is global climate crisis because of the kind of changing patterns of access and scarcity of water in this landscape. The economy of hydraulic infrastructure is kind of getting messed up. But I want to take, and of course, as this economy is getting messed up, there are other ways of re-engineering it. And what different types of words are enabled through this re-engineering? What different types of worlds are disabled through this engineering is what I'm thinking about with this talk. And I want to start with two stories. The first is the story of Malcolm Lyell Darling. He was a colonial bureaucrat in India. He wrote a book in 1934 called Wisdom and Waste. He traveled throughout these canal colonies to just kind of figure out what is happening there, what is the transformation. And I want to share with you this story that he shares in his book about two women. So he talks about when he was on the tour, a colonial bureaucrat on the tour, trying to find out how development is going. A development process is happening in this and what are the challenges. And he says, the two stalwart women pressed forward and prostrating themselves clung to my embarrassed feet. With difficulty, I got them to assume a more convenient attitude, and we all sat down, and they continued. The two matrons squatted in front and at once embarked upon a high-pitched duet, as unintelligible as and melodramatic as if it had been opera, but far less melodious. With difficulty, I turned the duet into a solo, which would be well described as appassionata. I can give only the gist of her theme. And he then kind of explains what they were saying. We came here before the English, before even the days of Savan Mal. Savan Mal was the previous governor before the English. He was the governor of Multan. 7 generations have we lived here. We sank 2 wells and cultivated the jungle. Wherever there was water from rain, and our camels grazed where they pleased. Then were we the lords of the jungle. But now our lands have been stolen. Here, 2 impassioned arms were flung out in my direction. So they sort of blame him for stealing the lands. And we may no longer go here and there with our camels, but must work for a wage and pick cottons, and our men must hire themselves out with their camels. Many have left the village and gone to seek work in the villages. We used to drink our fill of the milk of our goats and camels, but now our milk camels are few. There is no grazing for them. Some have died and the others are weak. And then he kind of stops, does not really dwell into it, but a few paragraphs later, he talks about, he kind of picks up the same theme again and talks about, on the way back, we talked of the Jonglis and their tale of woe. It is an old complaint, and whenever I meet them, I hear it. And he says, one is reminded of the tragedy of Red Indians, and one realizes with sadness the inexorable modern law which demands that he who produces little shall give way to him who produces much. So this developmental process, or this kind of transition from pastoralism to settler agrarian lifestyle, have been portrayed as an inexorable law of nature. So there's a certain politics of nature that I am kind of latching on to as I build this argument. And he ends his chapter with a quote from another colonial administrator of this particular canal colony. He says that the year has been one of real progress. The open spaces of the desert have everywhere been parceled out in meticulous rectangles. Jungle trees have been felled, and wandering camel tracks of the waste have given place to the durable macadam of public roads. He keeps saying that the nomad himself, once free of the bar and of his neighbor's cattle, has been pegged out, Prometheus-like, on his 25 acres, while the vultures of progress, who shall be nameless, bury their obscene beaks in his vitals. The process of development has been shown or is sort of imagined as a difficult process, but the one that needs to happen. And it's one that is in the public, collective public good. And so that is how this transition in this particular space happened. Now, as this hydraulic infrastructure faces global climate crisis, there's a politics of dam development. So, there was a politics of canal development that resulted in this transition of this landscape. Now there's a politics of dam development, and anybody who questions this idea of dam is considered as somebody who is less patriotic or even a traitor. Anybody who challenges is given this story of how a water crisis is descending like a thunderbolt on the society. So there's a certain urgency about it. A narrative of emergency is invoked to sort of dispossess people of their environmental commons and centralize authority on these environmental commons. So my idea generally is that the political economy of development has, at the present moment, transformed into a political ecology of crisis, and they are built on a similar idea of nature, and that idea of nature, an objective nature, then creates an idea or creates a binary of fact and fiction. Facts and fictions, facts that are produced by scientists and about nature that is out there. And then there are fictions or agreements that are created by people who are part of the society. And as people who have the experience of a long experience of colonial dispossession, we are always, and people in this landscape are always wary of grand narratives, especially grand narratives of development that create a kind of a spatial arrangement in which everything, all the facts are produced in the center. Even like in terms of economy, in this paper, I'm thinking more about the discursive economy, how the myths or cultures of the global South or cultures of the margin are brought into the center as fictions, and then the facts are spun around them in kind of contemporary academy, which is in the global North. And those facts are not just about the cultures. There's like a material economy, like the global periphery, global South has generally been a sort of producer of raw materials, some things that could be put together and produced as something different, right? So the core is where everything is assembled together and given its final ultimate shape, its ultimate narrative shape, discursive shape, material shape. And then there's also a sort of a temporal logic that is within this these ideas of development, that the people on the margin somehow exist in some sort of a past of contemporary core, and that they had to have a certain socioeconomic activities happening in order to come to the present. So what I'm saying is that the marginality as well as the past, so the spatial marginality in which the people, the global South has been pushed onto the both discursive and material economy of the globe, and the temporal marginality, which is that the global south is pushed in the past of the contemporary moment of development or contemporary moment of crisis. Both are sort of product of a certain understanding of development, and that are informing now a politics of global environmental crisis. A global environmental crisis in which the narratives are produced by certain places and certain people, and then shipped off to other parts of the world. So this universal knowledge, I think, kind of then enables a certain future, a future that is not, that people across the globe do not sort of relate with. And they challenge the universality of this modern knowledge, even universal narratives of the crisis and this point. So feminist studies and STS have talked about it. There's like a lot of critique of those global narratives of crisis and how narratives of emergency and narratives of crisis are used to dispossess people of their own resources. And then there's a critique of the temporalities embedded in these narratives of crisis. So, for example, Kyle White talks about how the indigenous people all over the world are already living in a dystopian future, which is imagined in the future of present moment within the scientific discourses or within the kind of discourses of development or modern European discourses. So these indigenous people are living within their own temporalities. They live at a different moment than the settler colonials. So you know, because indigenous people's ideas and many local communities' ideas are considered less factual or less facts or more cultural or more mythic or more fictional in a way, I think that the global environmental crisis, or particularly the insistence on crisis and emergency, enables a certain politics that continue to build on that colonial knowledge or colonial social, spatial, temporal temporalities that allow us to think about fact and fiction, science and cultures. And I want to challenge, I mean, I think with STS studies, I do agree with a lot of their critique of science. And I think what they do best is they critique the social fact and the scientific fact and try to bring them together. But what they do not talk about a great deal is about how stories have ontological implications, how fictions have ontological implications. And why fiction for me is important at this point, because fictions are part of how we imagine our future together, especially future in the wake of a crisis that is supposed to be a catastrophic moment in the history of our species. So, so that brings me to this idea of factional ecologies. They call the term that I have been, the concept that I've been sort of toying with for a minute. And my idea is that factional ecologies is a way of thinking that allows us to challenge this factual fictional binaries, and that it is against the universal and it against the representational. So these are some of the ideas that I'm kind of thinking with for now. And of course, I will look forward to our conversations after this talk and see, you know, how where they're going, or if there are other ways we can think about it. So faction. This is etymological definition of a faction. It comes from the word making or doing. Faction and fiction have the kind of similar etymological history, and they talk about they come from actually the word that means to do. So so what does factional and then also factional is used as kind of at present, it's generally used in a kind of a negative way in thinking about plurality. Faction is that creates factions, that creates dissent, that creates problems. But I'm thinking that with factional ecologies, we can celebrate that difference, celebrate in this particular moment, you know, a moment that is uncertain moment in global history, that we can celebrate that cultural difference. We can allow for multiplicities to happen, and that we can attend to a particular situation. What does it mean attending? What does attending to a particular situation means? For me, it means kind of thinking with those pastoral communities who are reimagining their futures, which is different than the future that is imagined and responded to in the discourses of science. So thinking with them how they're living a future in the present moment, and what are the possibilities of what possibilities of alternative worlds out there. And then, you know, attending to within that the kind of multiple possibilities. But for me, again, the challenges, what are the challenges? I think I understand what factional ecologies for me does, but there are two things that I want I want your help with. And the first of all, I think what factional ecologies allows me is to think about critique with care. That critique is a source of care, and it's not a source of criticism, or should not be a source of criticism. And it's important for me, and what I'm struggling with is that, you know, when you have somebody you know, at the helm of affair in our health department who have you know, alternative understanding of the world and of the facts, how, you know, this critique of global knowledge or shared or common knowledge then kind of enables those type of possibilities. And second, if it enables those types of possibility, how to attend to those possibilities, not with the similar, you know, disdain as they deal with this, with the global science, but with care. So so that's one thing, one challenge that I'm feeling. And the second, I was thinking about the knowledge commons, and I think there's a tradition which is I'm not sure how developed it is, because I mean, as I said earlier, I am new to Ostrom workshop, and it's a privilege literally to be here. And I think this space itself allows or animates factional ecologies of thinking with others, the people who are you know, bringing diverse point of views together. So I would definitely, you know, I'd appreciate if any leads on, you know, other people who work with Ostrom. There's definitely an idea in this what's the other book? Understanding knowledge as a commons, that creative works and fictions and imaginations of future are part of the knowledge commons. So I was just I was hoping to have you guide me in the right direction on who else are thinking along the same lines. I mean, there are. I read Governing the Knowledge Commons, which is more about you know, like how, what are the legal commons and property rights, and although there are of course cultural commons as a part of that, but I was also thinking if there are like people who talk about literatures, factions, as a part of knowledge commons, and how that helps us understand precarious futures differently. So I will stop here and I will take your comments, questions, and yeah, thank you.
Any questions?
For the grad students, right?
Yes.
Those are grad students.
Yes, so as a student, I want to have my own privilege. Thank you so much, Aijaz, for your great presentation. Actually, I have some, comments or question regarding your first part of presentation. I was wondering how your research could be, related to hydraulic mission paradigm, because you were talking about state and its power in controlling the water. So I was wondering how your research could be related to that paradigm and how institutional analysis could help to collaborate on your research. Understand your research question better. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. That's I think the hydraulic mission is in the Indus Basin and generally in Global South creates the kind of nature that I'm talking about, creates the kind of an archive of fact that I'm talking about. That all the knowledges of the subcontinent are sort of like pushed away, and a new understanding of rivers. And in my dissertation, I talk about like how nature and native were imagined as a part of nature, and they were both trained and put to work. Both nature, like rivers, were put to work, but along with it, the people who were brought to settle down in different parts of the canal colonies, they were put to work. And this was generally sold as a project of culture, as a project of cultivation and culture at the same time. So, controlling river enabled cultivation, controlling people enabled culture. So it does definitely, I think there's a certain critique, in my work of hydraulic mission, and how can I bring an institutional analysis to think about it? So that's where I think I have not worked a lot with institutional analysis. I'm thinking with it now. So I guess I don't have a good answer to that question, but that's I think this I'm going to take this moment of being with Ostrom people to think with it, like how can that enable me think about not just the past but also the future or collective future of the people in this landscape. But thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So for the talk, it's very inspiring. And my question also kind of started from like the beginning of the talk, with the quotes, and then also with the location, which you think about is the factional mythology. So and I also wanted to draw like the dots here, like the case here and then quotes from presumably some of the archival work done. And also I think there's a small subset under factional ecologies that you also said against that was institutional. How like what kind of how much archival and historical materials are drawn from, and then based on kind of this is kind of also the colonial remnants of the representation, the massive representation, the project, the logic of nature. how would you work with a piece of the
Thank you so much. That's such a fascinating question, and I have like a couple of responses to that. So South Asian history has a school of thought that's subaltern studies, that they have a particular method of going into the archive and reading the archive against the grain, reading the archive in a way that that kind of understands the subtext of it, or the context of it. And then the other way, and I actually have a piece on it, it's called minor history. So minor history is a history that exists along with the major history. The major history is the history of the state, the history of the archive, the way archive collects the information and brings it together. And the minor history is like those gaps, or the stories that continue to survive in the gaps, or in the sort of shades of the archive, because archive does not shine equal light on every story. So minor history then discovers or works with the stories that are told otherwise. So for example, what his telling of the story is that, oh, it was such a painful process, and she was wailing that they were lord of the bar at one moment, and now they have to settle down, and they don't have any or as many camel anymore, and that they have to work. But this transition is really important. They don't realize that that they are heading towards development. But I am totally reading it against maybe the intention of the archive, or the way the archive sustains it, right? So I'm thinking of it as setting up not a moment of development, but a moment of crisis that we are dealing right now. That was the moment that set up this hydrological crisis, rather hydrosocial crisis, by bringing people together in an arid landscape, controlling the river, that people are facing now. So development, not as a kind of cultural development or progress, but development as closely, or the histories of development as closely entwined with the contemporary crisis. And then secondly, I also want to respond to the faction ecologies are not representational. Representational in the sense that the fact fiction binary basically depends on this distinction that facts have an objective existence in the world, while fictions might not have that, right? So what I'm trying to challenge, I think, and this is like basically a larger idea of like how meanings are created. The text, how does scientific text create a meaning? Because it then takes you towards an actual world. I'm thinking that meanings are not behind the text, meanings are in front of the text. So critique is creative, it produces a world, it does not represent a world. It produces a world. It brings together. That's what factional, like the essence of factional is, that it does something to the world. It creates, it makes, it pulls different diverse parts together in case there's there's nothing behind it. Does that make sense? Or if you have follow-up question.
Right, I didn't expect the explanation of fractional, but I was kind of grasping with the idea of that, like in this classical like Saussurean, like represent like the signifier thing, and like the meanings behind that's okay. And then you're saying, oh, it's actually in front of venue.
I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah.
I mean,
But then situated here would be
Sorry, I can explain that with, in connection with the example of the archive. So the archive does not represent something. Look, I go to the archive, I take it to, to enable a different future. Right? So I'm doing something with it. I'm not saying that that's a truth, that's a fact, that's, you know, whatever, because that's what I'm challenging. There's no fact in fiction, right? I'm taking that fact and fiction, you know, or faction, and I'm building a new thing with it. I'm taking it towards a different direction. Right? So, I'm
Right, yes, I think.
I like that.
Yeah, I know, I like your response, and I think this is also, this probably your thinking, but also not too apparent in the talk, but this is also talking about like relevance of, you know, knowledge production and kind of how we think, how we actually know what we know and epistemology. Yeah, that would be a really important kind of add to, I think, the arguments and the contribution to that line of work.
Thank you.
I think Jessica. You want to-
Okay, I'm not sure if these are gonna come out right. I do love the idea of factional on so many levels. Okay. So my first question has to do with, you talked early on, there was this sort of idea about the communities that are living a future in their present moment.
Mhm.
And I want you to unpack that for us, because that must require that they're living somebody else's future.
Mhm.
Right? And so how do you think about that? Right? There's an interesting turn of agency in that phrase. The next question I have for you is whether you've read The Ministry of the Future. If so, what did you think of it? How does it help you, or does it help you? It's very much on one side of this, right? From an institutional formal perspective. If you haven't read it, it's a sort of alternate history of if the UN had designed an organization whose entire goal was to figure out how to organize the planet around climate disaster. As Kim Stanley Robinson, it's interesting, and there's actually some scholars using it to think about how do these, what I would argue, factional accounts shape how we are engaging with this question. And so I'd be curious, like at some point, if you get there, your thoughts on how scholars are thinking and using that text as a factional text. And then my final point is, I'm not sure if you were here on Monday for the colloquium, but there are many ways in which what you are doing is not actually dissimilar from what Armando was doing. And here's why. But Armando was saying, look, there's something that we believe out there that may or may not be some truth in formal rule, right? But that at the end of the day, one of the things that emerges is much more the result of how we construct narratives and beliefs about that thing. And that those are the things that actually matter. And the transmission of those things and the way in which they are transmission is actually mattering much more than some inherent truth in some formal rule. And so I find it incredibly fascinating that we can have a computational social scientist who's doing networked agent-based modeling, right? And a joint PhD in geography and English, really talking about, right, the importance of the construction of social knowledge, right? In a clear sort of dissent from some idea that there is a formal truth out there that we can all look to as it pertains to facts or institutions. So that's more of a comment that I love that you two are this week, because it's just like, it's just so cool the way that those two things are fitting together. So only the first thing was really an actual question, but.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think this is what kind of makes me be here more, is that like it's so diverse thing that when they come together and talk, they find out that there's, you know, maybe similar too. So in a way, I think that's why I think this space particularly performs the kind of factional ecologies that I'm thinking about in this. So the first question, and I actually want to go to this piece. Indigenous science fiction for the Anthropocene, ancestral dystopias, and fantasies of climate change crisis. So, what Kyle White is an indigenous scholar, fascinating work on climate and indigenous futures. What is saying that at the present moment, like the imagination about the future of crisis. First of all, like the crisis is imagined as something that is in the future, right? So catastrophe is in the future. It has not happened yet. And this temporal lag then also enables certain possibilities. And one of the possibilities that what kind of future we want. And then, mostly the kind of future that gets perceived as worth saving is the same future, the development progress that, the problem of, as if the problem of technologies are solved by more technology, or the problem of, anyway. So, but he says that within our own indigenous, if you talk to our ancestors, if you talk to our, elders, they are living their dystopia. So their landscape was stolen there, and so they are not just living their own dystopia, they're living their dystopia in a way. And that kind of then complicates this imaginary of like what future needs to be saved, right? There's like a future that we go out into future to save, or we sort of wade through the crisis to save a certain future, and then there is a past that needs to be recovered from this future. So then, the present moment becomes sort of like a very laden moment in which there are like possibilities of multiple futures, but then the politics defines what possibilities are pursued and what possibilities are not. So that's my reading of, and I think that I'm latching on White's idea of indigenous science fiction, and I think he's doing the kind of similar with actually another concept that I'm trying to work with is friction, but with sort of like those what do you call them, the two things, the brackets. The science fiction, he's kind of highlighting the factional nature of those narratives. So I'm building on that. Second, I have not read the Ministries of the Future.
History of the Future. It came out about 5 years ago, maybe. Maybe a little bit more than that. Kim Stanley Robinson. He wrote it coming out of, actually, I think he was at CASPS at Stanford while he was writing it. Or at least for a little while. But it became, for at least a little while, and if in full disclosure, I actually couldn't read the whole thing because the initial few chapters were so, I think I was telling Deanna this the other day, were so traumatic that I couldn't get, but in that way, it actually had this very much sort of like effect on me. But I do know that scholars have sort of looked at this as such a strong sort of, I'm gonna keep using your word, like factional story, as a way for thinking about like reimagining your individual place, role, shared story. So I would just be curious.
Thank you. I've not. I'm going to look into it and probably to that I have some.
To say that we should read it together. Like if anyone else wants to read it, we'll have, a session for discussing it.
Yeah.
If you want to read it. Okay, so let's read it. Whoever wants to read it, we'll have a book club discussion with Jess and we discuss.
That means I have to get through
I
it.
mean, yes, we have to
to
go
get
back
through
to it. No, it is allowed to skip parts if you don't want to read them. That is completely allowed. I wanted to thank you for your presentation. Just it's always fantastic to listen to you. I learned so much. It is brilliant, your work. And you addressed basically the three main points that the Commons program had for these 3 years, which were thinking with climate change. How do we think about global environmental commons? Thinking with what Commons research has been doing in the last decade or so, and it is precisely what you beautifully put as in terms of narratives of crisis and crisis of narratives. And I see your work precisely like taking the chance to take, I don't know, the risk of then imagining what a new narrative is, what a different narrative is. And that is super, super powerful. And then the third point is the university as commons. And I think that when you said, you know, it is fundamental to work against the dismissal. And that doesn't mean that we cannot critique, but it's not for criticism, it's for precisely building together, because smashing is super easy, building together is what is hard. So you address the three things that, you know, that I think are key for thinking about the commons today. And you would see that these are in line with research that has been going on in different spaces, from, I don't know, the big project that Arun Agrawal has on Reading the Commons, Fiona Gladstone on feminist takes on the commons, Gustavo Garcia and other people who were at the Ostrom workshop at some point and now are doing this encyclopedia of the commons as a way of understanding where is going the research on the commons. And you address all of the points that we have been discussing in those different spaces. Thank you for the reference to Kyle White's work. I haven't read his work. I will do it. I think that you would find super interesting Andreas Ballesteros' work. Do you know Andrea Ballesteros? She does SES, she's from Costa Rica, and she has a huge project based in the University of California, Santa Cruz, that is called The Social Life of Facts. Definite publications are already coming out in cultural anthropology and other journals, but I think you would find interesting conversations. And I think yours is much better than what they're doing. And they had millions of dollars to do that. So this is fantastic. Also, if maybe you read Dixa Ramirez's critique to Donna Haraway, she has a book that is called This Will Not Be Generative. So if you have read Donna Haraway, like Donna Haraway, but want a critique to Donna Haraway, I think Dixa Ramirez does it in such a beautiful way. So we can also add that to readings if we want to share. And just briefly, well, you answered my question already. My question was about minor theory, and you already answered it with minor history in relation to Angelina's question. So that is you already answered my question. But I also wanted to suggest perhaps journals for this piece that you're thinking. If I understood right, you are, you know, in the project of writing your book manuscript, but this would be part of a specific paper. And I think that article would be perfect for Progress in Environmental Geography. They have been doing a lot of super interesting work. Diana Bruno's piece was recently published there. And also, yes, Environment and Planning E. But I think Progress in Environmental Geography would be a fantastic space because they do this kind of literature review, but like agenda setting kind of articles. So just to say that, thank you so much for sharing your work.
My God, you were so generous, Diana. I mean, it's people like you and Jess and, you know, others around that, you know, I just immediately out of my PhD and not finding a job, like, had given me like a, you know, a gut punch to my confidence. And then having you people kind of, you know, being so supportive and encouraging, I think this is really, and it's literally, as I said in the beginning, a privilege to think with you about this. I really feel lucky to have people do and thank you for sharing those references with me. You shared with me this will not be generative.
To read it together.
We have definitely need to read this together, and we will. Sure. But thank you so much. You're so kind. Yes.
Okay, I loved this presentation so much. It was so fascinating to me. I have three things that I'm going to try to be really quick about. I'm sure you've read this, but have you looked at Cascal's expansion on hydrohegemony?
I have not.
Oh my gosh, you're gonna love it. Okay, so she has this particular part on.
The reading list is getting longer.
No, but like this is so relevant for you.
No, I love it. Yeah.
So she works particularly on an expansion of hydrohegemony that looks at ideational power and discourse control as both perpetuating, reinforcing, and you know, even creating these power asymmetries, but then also in suppressing other narratives. And the way that in and of itself is, you know, like a form of exercising power, which is really, really cool. Yeah, like I want to keep talking about it with you so much, but like she works on the Nile. And so she talks about the different ways that different actors in this highly asymmetric basin, they can have all of their protests delegitimized through the securitization of other kinds of land. And so, yeah, I think it's fit. I did have I had a quick question. It might be stupid. I apologize in advance, but I wanted to ask if these pasts are not included as fact or preserved. So those people that are impacted by these like futures are already living their dystopia. Is it then that we are not just then recreating imagined pasts? And like, is that problematic?
Hey, can you say that again? Sorry.
So if these marginalized peripheral characters are already living a dystopian present, and there is no real like legitimized record of what their past experiences were, in order to correct this, is it even possible? Because then we just have to have an imagined past that we're then trying to legitimize. And we're not really legitimizing what it was, we're legitimizing what we imagine it to be.
Right.
And I have, if you could just make a note of it, I have one more thing. So stuff on politics of memory, have you spoken to Elisa Frankel from the visual anthropology department? She's so cool. She works on she worked on museums for a long time, and like what is represented there, how we share knowledge in those places. I just think that she'll have like really, like she particularly does things like what words are allowed to be used, like who gets to decide how we preserve those narratives and stuff. And so I can give you her email if you want, but she's an amazing person.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I really look forward to reading that. I think there's a lot of what I'm doing with my work is already there. So it's to be in conversation.
So well.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And also thank you for you said Lisa Franklin?
Elisa Frankel.
Elisa Frankel. Okay. Okay, thank you. And you know the question, pardon me if I'm like if I don't totally get it, but I think you know the conversation will help. So when you talk about like these people, are you talking about those women that I started this conversation with?
Yeah,
Or?
sorry, any person, any peripheral character that you're saying has had their opportunity to experience their present disrupted by other people's imagined futures. If I'm
Yeah, you're right. No.
okay, so if these are already disrupted, they're all situation of and all of their understandings have been dismissed. How do we capture past? Like how do we give justice to those things? That past doesn't exist anymore. Aren't we just like imagining past? Aren't they then just past even? It's not
Right.
Is that problem? It's not necessary.
Your history, your answer, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. No, you're right. I think there's a certain politics of memory involved here, right? A politics of past, a politics of archive. What worlds are still available but are in the past, you know, in the archive, and what worlds are not even available in the archive, right? So there are multiple ways of thinking about it. As I said, like, you know, there's a subaltern, you know, history that like how you go to the people and like how they were, the history of the people who were responding to power instead of talking about the history of the power, right? Then there's minor history, which is like not the people who are responding to power, not the people who are exercising power, but in the cracks, something survives and attending to that. Then the third, you know, that helps me is critical fabulation in Saidiya Hartman's work on like how to access archive without sort of reproducing the violence that is connected with it. The thing is that like when I use these texts, and I think that is where my politics are, that I use this text, I first of all, I don't think there are any pasts that need be revived. There are only futures to be saved or enabled, right? There are only futures to be enabled, right? So I take this story and I kind of put this in conversation with the idea of with the larger narratives around future, like, you know, what kind of us. It's like, you know, if they are already living this dystopia and then they are, you know, heading towards the dystopia of the current world, then, you know, can we sort of think differently about futures? Can we enable other types of futures, not necessarily going back to the past, because there's no way, there is no past that is available. Because if I believe in there is a past that is available, then I might be living in representationalism in a way, right? And I challenge that. I don't think, you know, you can only take a past and do something with it. You can't say that this past is actually exactly like the past that there was, right? So I'm just taking a past and doing something. So there's nothing behind the text. There's nothing behind the archive. There's only a future of the archive. There's only a future of the narrative. There's only a future of the past. I hope it. Thank you.
That's great.
So one comment that is kind of tangential to your topic, but maybe you want to think about it, is the characterization of core versus periphery. At least that is at least probably 80. So essentially, China has a manufacturing sector twice the size of the US. I'm checking here the main exports of the US to China: oil seeds and grains, primarily soybeans, oil and gas. Only third place, we're talking about machineries, something. Should we consider, according to that definition, the US as a periphery? Exporting raw materials. So Australia is mainly exporting all raw materials, but it's a very wealthy country. Norway too. So should we consider those places peripheries? I think we need something. We need something else to think about this, and it might be important, but I don't think affect highly, because again, I didn't quite get how that is connected with the rest. So maybe it's not that important, but some way of thinking about that. So.
No, thank you. That's definitely important in the sense that I'm talking about geographies of development, right? So geographies of development creates a hierarchy, a hierarchical role for different places. And if, for example, the economy is cohere around China's economy, it's still the hierarchy. It's the same hierarchy. In a way, it's just like it's changing its spatial location. And why I think it's important to question that hierarchy is because generally then what happens is that the center becomes the arbiter of the truth, of the fact. Right? So what gets constituted in the center, it becomes knowledge. And of course, economy in so many ways. So that's why I said material knowledge. So factional ecologies, I mean, there's of course always a way of thinking with this idea of core periphery at different scales. Right? So if I think of core periphery in Lahore, and there's like a fascinating work on the canal colonies, that like why development did not happen in these canal colonies despite it's sort of a huge increase in production. These economies, these canal colonies in Punjab, here, modern production increased production of all agricultural products manyfold. But the village, the space, all the canal colonies, like the other signs of progress were not there. And you know, the scholar who writes this argument thinks that it is because of this core periphery idea that, you know, that everything ends up going somewhere else. Because it happened under colonial period, right? So there are different spatial scales on which we can mobilize the idea of core and periphery, but at every scale, what it ends up doing is creating this power hierarchy in which the center or the core sits at a position where it enables certain facts or certain futures or certain power hierarchies or certain stories. So, I mean, and factional ecologies tries to sort of, it's not that factional ecologies gives like a prescription to how to challenge this, but factional ecologies then sort of reveals this imbalance, or reveals that where fact is produced and where fictions are produced.
Can I have a quick follow-up?
Actually, we are running out of time and we could have this discussion after.
I mean, I can definitely,
Okay.
I'm here, we can continue talking.
What I was thinking is like, if, given that the most interesting question is not, so India got independence 75 years ago. So essentially, why these patterns persisted after, you know, 3/4 of a century after the colonial period is over, that may be more interesting for today than rather the colonial origins, no? So because that give you what are the patterns right now that make this thing persist. Okay, so for me the most interesting thing is like why even after independence these places did not develop, no? And then you may think, well, initially after independence, you know, there's kind of national organization, but now we are reaching a point at which the national reorganization period of India is over a long time ago. So essentially, and still the pattern persists, you start thinking that maybe there is something else going on, no? And that's probably more interesting for today than the colonial history. So essentially.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. I mean, then there would be an assumption that after partition or after independence, India had equal chances of succeeding or developing its own on its own than, let's say, Great Britain or United States.
So just to be honest, for example, for the next year, like for the next 50 years, I have more hope for India than for Great Britain. Just to give you an idea of I think so. Essentially, I'm not quite sure. I understand that the initial organization period is problematic because we have evidence that after independence, countries go through civil war and many problems. But after you settle that initial reorganization, national reorganization period, I'm not quite sure the economic performance of Great Britain since, or take the same period, so post-Second World War period has been pretty.
I mean, agree, but like how we're looking at it. For example, you're looking at it with the general idea of what counts as development, right?
Yes.
Right? I'm looking at it, please. I'm looking at it, how power is distributed. And the power, not just to sort of